All right, let's dive deep today. We're tackling decision making.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, should be fun. We've got excerpts from Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow.
Okay.
We've also got a blog post that kind of summarizes it, and even a YouTube video breaking it all down.
Ambitious.
It is, but I'm excited to see where this takes us.
Yeah, I think we can pull some real gems from these sources and help you understand how your mind works.
That's what we're here for. So, Kahneman's book starts off with this idea that we have two systems of thinking, System 1 and System 2.
Right. It's almost as if you have two advisors in your head, each with a totally different style.
I like that.
System 1 is your quick, intuitive advisor, always ready with a snap judgment.
Uh-huh.
It's the system that tells you 2 plus 2 equals 4 without even thinking, or helps you dodge a ball coming right for you.
Yeah, it's that gut feeling you get, and it often feels effortless.
Right.
But then there's System 2, which is more like that advisor who carefully weighs all the options before giving advice. It kicks in when you're, like, solving a complex problem or making a decision that requires, like, careful thought.
And that YouTube video you mentioned actually highlighted the physical signs of System 2 kicking in.
Oh, yeah.
Remember how they talked about pupils dilating, heart rate increase? Like your brain is signaling, hold on, this needs some serious processing power.
It's amazing how our body reacts when we engage in deep thinking.
Yeah.
They even mentioned a study where people had to memorize strings of numbers longer and longer.
Okay.
Their pupils dilated more and more as the mental effort increased.
Okay.
But then, get this, they started to actually shrink.
Wow.
It was like System 2 just couldn't handle it anymore.
That's a great example of how our cognitive abilities have limitations.
Yeah.
But what's really fascinating is how these two systems, System 1 and System 2, influence every decision we make.
That's where things get really interesting.
Right.
Because Kahneman dives into how System 1, with its reliance on intuition and mental shortcuts, can actually lead to some predictable biases.
Yeah.
He calls these shortcuts heuristics.
And one of the most striking examples he gives is the Steve problem.
Okay.
Imagine you're given a description of someone named Steve. Shy, tidy, loves detail.
Okay.
Would you say Steve is more likely to be a farmer or a librarian?
Honestly, my first thought would be a librarian. Just, he kind of fits the stereotype.
That's exactly what most people say.
Yeah.
And it highlights how our reliance on representativeness can lead us astray.
Oh, okay.
We instinctively compare Steve to our mental image of a librarian,
Right.
but we completely overlook the statistical reality that there are far more farmers than librarians.
It makes you wonder how often we make snap judgments about people based on these stereotypes without even realizing we're doing it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's just one example of how these heuristics, while useful for quick thinking, can lead to biases that impact our decisions in all sorts of situations.
Another one that caught my eye was the Linda problem. This one is a real mind bender.
Oh, tell me about it.
You're given a description of Linda, who is described as outspoken, bright, and deeply concerned about social justice.
Okay.
Then you're asked to rank the probability of different statements about her.
Okay.
And surprisingly, most people say it's more likely that Linda is a feminist bank teller than just a bank teller.
Interesting.
But that doesn't make any sense.
Right.
Statistically, it's more probable for her to be a bank teller, regardless of whether she's a feminist.
Exactly. But it seems like our brains are so drawn to creating this coherent narrative that we overlook basic probability.
Right.
We want Linda's personality to fit neatly into a category, even if it leads us to a logically flawed conclusion.
It's like our System 1 is just trying to tell a good story.
I think so.
Even if it has to bend the rules of logic a little bit.
And this tendency to prioritize a compelling narrative over statistical probability is something we see play out in all sorts of ways, from how we assess risk to how we form opinions.
Yeah, it's making me question everything.
Right.
Then there's this thing called the anchoring effect.
Okay.
This one blew me away.
Oh, wow.
It suggests that even a completely random number can influence our judgments.
That's wild.
Yeah, Kahneman describes a study where participants were asked to estimate the percentage of African nations in the United Nations.
Okay.
But before answering, they spun a wheel of fortune with numbers from 1 to 100.
Gotcha.
And what they found was that those who saw a higher number on the wheel gave significantly higher estimates.
Wow.
Even though the wheel spin was completely irrelevant.
So just seeing a random number, even if it's totally unrelated, can actually influence our estimations.
It appears so. It's as if that random number acts as an anchor.
Right.
Pulling our judgments towards it even when we know it shouldn't.
That's remarkable.
And thinking about this in like the real world, it makes you wonder how much this anchoring effect influences us daily. Like how much we're willing to pay for a house or donate to charity.
You're right. It's not just a laboratory phenomenon.
No.
The book suggests that this anchoring effect is at play in like everyday situations.
Yeah.
Subtly shaping our perceptions and decisions.
It's scary. It makes you realize how much our minds are influenced by factors we're not even aware of.
Right.
What about the availability heuristic?
Oh, yeah, that's another one.
That's another way our brains can play tricks on us, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. The availability heuristic basically means we judge the likelihood of something happening based on how easily examples come to mind.
Right.
If something is easy to recall, we tend to overestimate its frequency or probability.
So, like, if you've just seen a news report about a plane crash,
right,
you might suddenly feel like flying is incredibly dangerous.
Exactly.
Even though, statistically, it's still one of the safest modes of transportation.
The vividness and recency of that news report make it readily available in your memory, which influences your perception of risk.
And this can be especially dangerous when it comes to media coverage.
Oh, absolutely.
Which can create these availability cascades, right?
Availability cascades, yeah.
What are those?
Essentially, when media hype around a particular event or issue can create a widespread perception of risk or danger that's disproportionate to the actual threat.
So it's like blown out of proportion?
Yeah. The book mentions the LR scare in the 1980s.
Oh. Right.
It's an example.
That was when people were terrified of apples because of a chemical called alar.
Yeah.
That was supposedly carcinogenic.
Right. But in reality, the actual risk was incredibly small.
Yeah.
The media coverage was so intense
and
widespread that it created a public panic, even though the scientific evidence didn't support the level of fear.
It's a stark example of how the availability heuristic can be exploited and how easily our perceptions can be manipulated. It's really making me think twice about how I process information and form opinions.
It's important to be mindful.
Yeah, but we're not done yet, are we? What about regression to the mean?
Ah, yes.
Okay, here we go.
This one is a bit counterintuitive, but incredibly important to understand.
Okay.
Essentially, regression to the mean means that extreme events, whether good or bad, are usually followed by more average outcomes.
Okay.
It's a statistical principle, and we often misinterpret it as a cause and effect relationship.
So, like, if a student gets an unusually high score on a test, they're statistically more likely to get a lower score on the next one.
Yeah.
Simply because their performance is likely to regress back toward their average ability.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
And Kahneman uses the example of a flight instructor who observed that cadets who performed exceptionally well in a training exercise tended to do worse on the next one, while those who did poorly tended to improve.
Interesting.
He initially attributed this to praise or punishment.
Thinking he was somehow influencing their performance.
But in reality, it was just natural fluctuation.
Precisely.
In their performance, regressing back towards their average skill level.
Exactly.
Interesting.
And this tendency to misinterpret regression to the mean can lead us to make incorrect judgments and decisions in all sorts of areas, from business to education to personal relationships.
It's amazing how these subtle statistical principles can impact our understanding of the world.
It really is.
Okay, so we've talked about heuristics and biases.
Right.
But what about our actual ability to predict the future?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. Kahneman argues that even experts often overestimate their ability to predict future events. Especially in unpredictable environments. He calls this the illusion of skill.
So even those with years of experience and specialized knowledge can fall prey to this?
Yes. The book uses examples from the financial world, where stock pickers, despite their expertise and access to tons of data, rarely outperform the market consistently. So what does that mean for the rest of us? Should we just give up on trying to make predictions?
Not necessarily. There are things we can predict with reasonable accuracy, especially in the short term. Or in areas where we have a lot of data. But it's important to be aware of this illusion of skill. and to recognize that our predictions are often more uncertain than we think.
It's a humbling reminder that we don't always have as much control over the future as we'd like to think.
It's true.
But if even experts can be fooled by this illusion of skill, what are we supposed to trust when making decisions?
That's a great question, and it leads us to one of the most surprising insights from the book. The power of algorithms.
Algorithm.
Yeah. You mean relying on a set of rules or a mathematical formula?
Yeah.
Could be more accurate than our own intuition?
That's what I'm thinking, yeah.
It might seem counterintuitive, but there's a growing body of evidence to support this.
Okay.
Kahneman even describes his own experience designing a system for selecting soldiers, using an algorithm that proved to be more accurate than the judgments of experienced interviewers.
So are you saying we should all just become robots and blindly follow algorithms?
Of course not. Human judgment is still crucial in many situations.
Okay.
But we should be open to the possibility that algorithms can be incredibly helpful tools for making more objective and accurate decisions.
Especially in areas where our own biases might lead us astray.
Absolutely.
It's a fascinating and thought-provoking idea.
It is.
And it seems like we've just scratched the surface of what Kahneman has to offer.
Oh, yeah.
In Thinking Fast and Slow.
We've covered a lot of ground, but we're just getting started. There's so much more to explore, from prospect theory, which won Kahneman the Nobel Prize, to his fascinating work on the two selves.
I'm already feeling like I need to take a break
Yeah.
and let my system 2 process all of this.
Yeah, it's a lot.
But I'm eager to hear more. This has been an incredibly insightful deep dive so far. Welcome back, listeners. I'm still processing all those insights about heuristics and biases, especially that anchoring effect. It's wild how a random number can influence our judgments. But we've got more to uncover from Thinking Fast and Slow, right? What about those two selves you mentioned?
Ah, yes, the experiencing self and the remembering self. These concepts really get into how we perceive and remember our experiences. And you'll see it has a huge impact on our future decisions.
So is this like having two different personalities inside of us?
Not quite personalities, more like two different ways of experiencing and processing our lives.
Yeah.
The experiencing self is the one living in the present moment, feeling all the sensations and emotions of an experience as it unfolds. It's the you that's actually living through each moment.
So it's like the me right now listening to this and taking it all in.
Precisely. But then there's the remembering self. This is the you that looks back on past experiences, creating memories, forming a narrative of your life. And what's fascinating is that the remembering self doesn't always accurately reflect what the experiencing self went through.
You mean our memories can be, like, unreliable?
More than just unreliable, they're actually systematically biased. Kahneman talks about this thing called duration neglect, which means the remembering self doesn't really care how long an experience lasted. Instead, it focuses more on the peak moments of intensity and the very ending.
Wait, so the length of an experience doesn't matter as much as, like, how it felt at its most intense point and how it ended?
It seems counterintuitive, but that's what the research suggests. Remember the peak end rule we touched on earlier. Kahneman illustrates this with the example of colonoscopies. People who had a slightly longer colonoscopy, but where the discomfort gradually decreased towards the end, actually rated the whole experience as less unpleasant than those who had a shorter procedure with consistent discomfort.
That's crazy. So even though they endured more total discomfort, the fact that it, like, tapered off at the end made the memory more bearable.
Exactly. It highlights how the remembering self prioritizes the intensity of the peak and the feeling at the end, even if it means distorting the overall experience.
So how does this, like, play out in everyday life, beyond colonoscopies, I mean?
Think about vacations. Let's say you go on a 2-week trip, and the first week is filled with these amazing adventures, but the second week is kind of let down. How do you think you'll remember that vacation a year later?
I'd probably still think of it as a pretty great vacation overall. You know, that first week was so good, it would overshadow the less exciting second week.
Exactly. The peak end rule suggests that your remembering self would prioritize those peak moments of that fantastic first week and the feeling of the last day, even though, objectively, half the trip wasn't that great.
It's almost like we're tricking ourselves into remembering things more positively than they actually were.
In a way, yes. And this isn't just about vacations. Think about painful experiences. If you go through a really difficult breakup, but the very last interaction you have with your ex is amicable, that might color your overall memory of the entire relationship.
So it's not just about rose-tinting positive memories, but also potentially downplaying negative ones if the ending feels, like, resolved.
Precisely. And this leads to a fascinating tension between the experiencing self and the remembering self. The book even suggests that the remembering self can sometimes lead us to make decisions that are not in the best interest of the experiencing self.
You mean we might choose something that sounds better in retrospect, even if it means having a worse experience in the moment?
That's the idea. Kahneman talks about this crazy experiment called the cold hand experiment. Participants had to submerge their hand in ice water for a certain amount of time. Then they were given a choice: repeat the same experience or try a slightly longer one where the water temperature gradually increased in the last few moments.
So they had a choice between a shorter, consistently cold experience or a longer one that ended with slightly less cold water.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that most people chose the longer option, even though it meant more overall discomfort. They opted for the one with the less painful ending because that's what their remembering self would focus on. It's as if they were prioritizing a better memory over a better actual experience.
Wow, it really shows how powerful the remembering self can be, even if it leads to seemingly irrational choices. So what does this all mean for us? How can we use this knowledge of the two selves to make better decisions?
Well, it starts with awareness. By understanding that our memories are shaped by duration neglect and the peak end rule, we can start to question whether our recollections are truly representative of our experiences. The book encourages us to ask ourselves, what really matters to us? Is it the actual quality of our experiences in the moment, or just how we remember them later on?
It's almost like we need to pay more attention to our experiencing self and not let the remembering self completely dominate our decision making. But what about all those cognitive biases we discussed earlier? Can we actually overcome those?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? While thinking fast and slow provides these incredible insights into these biases, it doesn't offer a simple recipe for perfect rationality. Kahneman himself admits that even he, after decades of studying these biases, still falls prey to them sometimes.
So are we all doomed to be irrational creatures?
Not doomed, but it definitely takes conscious effort and vigilance to counteract these biases. One of the most important things is simply to be aware of them. If we know we're prone to anchoring, availability bias, framing effects, and so on, we can at least try to pause and question our initial judgments.
So it's about slowing down, engaging system two, and asking ourselves, am I being influenced by a bias here? Is my system one uh, leading me astray?
Exactly. It's about recognizing that our intuitive judgments are not always reliable, and that taking the time to deliberately weigh the evidence can lead to better decisions.
And I remember Kahneman discussing this idea of nudges, how small changes in the way choices are presented can influence us to make better decisions. It's like we can use our knowledge of these biases to create environments that encourage more rational choices.
That's right. He drew upon the work of Thaler and Sunstein, who popularized the concept of libertarian paternalism, which suggests that we can design systems that subtly guide people towards choices that are in their best interest without actually restricting their freedom of choice.
So it's not about forcing people to do something, but rather making it easier for them to choose the option that's likely to benefit them most.
Precisely. Think about making healthy food options more prominent in the cafeteria, or automatically enrolling employees in a retirement savings plan unless they opt out. These are subtle changes that can have a significant impact on people's choices, without taking away their freedom to decide.
It's fascinating how these seemingly small interventions can actually leverage our understanding of human behavior to create positive outcomes. This whole conversation has been incredibly thought-provoking. We've covered so much ground. Two systems of thinking, heuristics and biases, two selves battling it out. It's a lot to process.
It is a lot, but don't feel overwhelmed. The goal isn't to become these perfectly rational beings. That's not realistic or even necessarily desirable. What Kahneman is ultimately encouraging us to do is to be more mindful of how our minds work, to understand our own limitations, and to appreciate the complex interplay of intuition, emotion, and reason in our decision-making.
It's about self-awareness, recognizing when we need to slow down and engage system two, and also knowing when it's okay to trust our gut feelings.
Exactly. And ultimately, it's about making choices that lead to a richer, more fulfilling life, one that's aligned with our true values and goals.
Well said. All right, deep divers, that wraps up part 2 of our exploration of thinking fast and slow. In part 3, we'll delve into how we can practically apply these insights to our own lives, and wrap up with Kahneman's final thoughts on the implications of his work. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into thinking fast and slow.
Glad to be back.
Yeah, we've explored how our minds work, all the biases we're prone to, even the difference between our experiencing and remembering selves. But now I want to get practical.
Okay.
How can we actually use all this knowledge to make better decisions in our lives?
That's the key question, right?
It is.
Kahneman doesn't give us like a step-by-step guide to being perfectly rational,
Right.
but he offers some really valuable insights that we can apply.
So where do we start? One of the most powerful tools is slowing down.
Okay.
I know it sounds simple,
Yeah,
almost impossible in our fast-paced world,
it is.
but it's crucial.
So system one is always running in the background.
Yeah, always ready to offer quick judgments
Okay.
when you're facing a decision that really matters.
Like a big purchase.
A big purchase, a career change, a relationship choice.
Right.
Don't just go with your gut.
Let system two take over.
Exactly. Take the time to pause, engage system two, ask yourself some critical questions.
Like, am I being swayed by a bias right now?
Yeah. Or, is there more information I need before deciding?
It's like that old saying, measure twice, cut once.
Exactly.
But instead of wood, we're talking about life choices.
Exactly.
What about all this stuff about loss aversion? How do we deal with that practically?
Loss aversion is a strong force, but we can learn to work with it.
Okay.
One technique is to reframe your perspective.
Like how?
Instead of fixating on what you might lose, focus on what you could gain.
So let's say I'm hesitant to invest money because I'm terrified of losing it.
Right.
I should instead focus on the potential growth.
The potential growth and the financial security.
Okay.
It's not about ignoring the risks, but weighing them against the potential rewards.
Right.
Remember, loss aversion can also be a motivator.
Oh, so.
If you're trying to achieve a goal, sometimes it helps to frame it in terms of what you could lose if you don't succeed.
Oh, interesting.
Instead of saying, I want to eat healthier, you could say, I don't want to miss out on the energy that comes with a healthy lifestyle.
It's like reverse psychology on your own brain.
Exactly.
Okay. How about those insights on the remembering self?
That one's tricky.
It is.
It's like we need to become more aware of how we're shaping our memories.
Yeah.
The remembering self focuses on peaks and endings,
Right.
but we can train ourselves to appreciate the whole journey,
Even the boring part.
even the boring parts.
Okay.
So instead of rushing through a meal just to get to dessert, you savor every bite, the flavors, the company.
It's about being present,
Exactly.
not just focused on the end.
That's it.
And when we look back, we try to remember things more balanced.
More balanced, yeah.
Not just the highlights.
It's like Kahneman is saying, hey, your experiencing self deserves some credit too.
I like that.
Don't let the remembering self take all the glory.
He also talked about how understanding the peak end rule helps us make choices about how we spend our time.
Right.
So when you're planning a vacation, don't just cram it full of activities.
Don't just cram it full.
Make sure there's some downtime.
Downtime, relaxation, reflection, yeah.
So just sitting on the beach with a book.
Might not be Instagrammable,
No.
but it could make for a much more satisfying experience.
This whole conversation has been so eye-opening.
It has.
Makes you realize that our minds are way more complex than we think.
Kahneman's work reminds us that we're not always the rational creatures we think we are.
But that's not necessarily a bad thing, is it?
Not at all.
By understanding our quirks, we can work with them
Make more conscious choices?
and live better lives, right?
Exactly. It's not about perfect rationality.
Right.
It's about self-awareness, using our knowledge and choosing a life that feels good in the moment and in retrospect.
I love that. Well, listeners, we've reached the end of our deep dive into thinking fast and slow. I hope you feel as energized and empowered as I do.
I do.
Keep those brains buzzing, keep questioning your assumptions, and keep making those conscious choices.
Embrace both your System 1 and System 2, your experiencing self and your remembering self. They make us human.
Well said. Until next time, happy deep diving.